She already turned you down, Harlan, and that is her answer. Andrew Watkins did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The words came out of him low and level, like the pull of a trigger before the hammer falls, and every man standing in the dusty yard of the Fletcher property heard them land with the weight of iron. Harlan Cole stood 10 feet away, his jaw tight, his riding gloves still in his fist from where he had yanked them off in frustration. Behind him, 2 of his ranch hands shifted their boots in the dry earth, neither one willing to meet Andrew's eyes. And between the 2 men on the porch steps stood Nellie Fletcher, her hands pressed flat against the wood railing, her knuckles pale, her dark hair loose around her shoulders because Harlan had arrived without notice and she had not had time to pin it up properly. She was not trembling. That was the thing about Nellie Fletcher that men like Harlan Cole always underestimated. She did not tremble. But Andrew had seen her face the moment Harlan's boots hit the first porch step uninvited, and he had crossed the field from his side of the fence line in less than 2 minutes, which meant he had been watching, or he had been close, or maybe some part of him had known this morning was going to break open into something dangerous. He had not come running. He had walked, fast and deliberate, the way a man walks when he has decided something and is not changing his mind. Harlan's lip curled. "This is between me and the lady, Watkins. I don't recall asking for your interpretation of the situation." "You don't need to recall asking," Andrew said. "She told you no yesterday. She told you no the week before that. You rode up here again today anyway. That is not conversation, Cole. That is a pattern." The word hung in the air between them like smoke. Harlan's chest expanded. Nellie's voice came from the steps, quieter than either man's but sharper. "Harlan, I think you should leave." Harlan looked at her. Something moved through his face, a complicated ugliness that Nellie recognized from the first time he had come to the property after her father died, dressed in his good Sunday coat and carrying a bottle of bourbon as a gift, offering to take the burden of the ranch off her hands, as if the ranch were a burden and not the only thing her father had ever left her. "I am trying to help you, Nellie," Harlan said, and his voice shifted into something almost gentle, which was worse. "This land is drowning you. You don't have enough hands. You don't have enough water rights. I can solve both of those problems tomorrow morning with one signature. The signature being on a marriage certificate," Andrew said. Harlan's eyes snapped back to him. "Stay out of this." "No." That single syllable dropped like a stone into still water, and the ripples went out in every direction. Harlan stared at Andrew for a long moment, measuring him, calculating, and Andrew stood there and let himself be measured. He was not a particularly large man, Andrew Watkins. He was lean in the way that men who work cattle every day of their lives become lean, with forearms like rope, and a face that had been burned by the New Mexico sun into something angular and unyielding. He was 31 years old and he had been ranching since he was 14, and there was not a soft edge left on him anywhere. But his eyes, when he looked at Harlan Cole, were something else entirely. They were the color of storm clouds over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and they were absolutely still. "You are making an enemy today," Harlan said. "I expect I already had one," Andrew replied. Harlan put his gloves back on slowly, one finger at a time, and turned to look at Nellie one last time. "You think about what I said. This is not a door I will hold open forever." Nellie looked at him. "Then close it," she said. Harlan Cole walked back to his horse, mounted without another word, and rode away with his men behind him, and the dust they kicked up drifted south in the dry morning wind. For a long moment, neither Nellie nor Andrew said anything. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that had been building for 2 years, since Andrew Watkins bought the broken-down Ray's property on the eastern edge of her land and started fixing it board by board, post by post, without asking anyone for help or permission. The kind of silence that accumulates between 2 people who are neighbors before they are friends and who become friends before either of them is willing to call it anything else. "You did not have to do that," Nellie said finally. Andrew looked at her. His expression was not soft exactly, but it was careful in a way that had nothing to do with calculation. "I know," he said. She pulled a loose strand of hair behind her ear and looked out at the road Harlan had taken, already gone to dust and distance. "He is not going to stop," she said. "No," Andrew agreed. "He is not." She looked back at him then, and something passed between them that neither of them put words to, because there were no words yet for whatever it was. There had not been words for it for 2 years. There was only this, the fact of him crossing the field when he saw trouble coming, and the fact that she was glad he had, and the fact that neither of them was quite ready to look at what that gladness meant. "I have coffee on," she said. "All right," he said, and he followed her inside. It had been 2 years and 4 months since Andrew Watkins first arrived in the territory of New Mexico, in the high desert country northwest of Santa Fe, in the spring of 1882. He had come from Texas, from the Edwards Plateau, where he had spent 7 years working another man's cattle for another man's profit, and had finally saved enough to buy something of his own. He was not a man who spoke easily about his past, which was one of the first things Nellie noticed about him, because in a small ranching community in the late 19th century, history was currency, and a man who hoarded his history was either hiding something or had been hurt enough to know that sharing it cost too much. In Andrew's case, it was both. He had been married once briefly to a woman named Clara in Texas. They had been young, too young, and the marriage had lasted 14 months before Clara left with a cattle buyer from San Antonio who had better prospects and a smoother tongue. Andrew had not tried to stop her going. He had understood, in some quiet part of himself that he rarely visited, that he had already failed her by being the kind of man who loved a piece of land more than he loved being loved, and that was a failure he could not argue his way out of. He had signed whatever papers needed signing and gone back to work, and not spoken of it again. But Clara's leaving had done something to him. Not broken him precisely. Hardened him was the word his old foreman used. The way a green piece of wood hardens when it sits in the sun long enough, until it will not bend anymore without cracking. Andrew Watkins at 31 was not cruel and he was not cold, but he had constructed himself very carefully into a man who did not need things, because needing things meant they could be taken from you, and things taken left marks. The Ray's property had cost him nearly everything he had saved. It was 50 acres of high desert rangeland with a collapsed barn, a house with a rotted porch, a dry creek bed, and a fence line that would need 3 months of work before it could hold anything. It was also beautiful in the specific, brutal way of that country, all red rock and sage and sky that went forever, and Andrew had stood on the top of the rise the first morning he owned it, and felt something loosen in his chest that he did not have a name for. Nellie Fletcher's property began on the other side of the western fence line, and ran another 120 acres to the base of the foothills. Her father, James Fletcher, had worked it for 20 years before his heart gave out in the winter of 1881, and he had left it entirely to Nellie because Nellie was his only child, and because James Fletcher had been the kind of man who knew the difference between what was legal and what was right. And in 1882, New Mexico, a woman inheriting land outright was not common. But James Fletcher had arranged it carefully and left a lawyer in Santa Fe with instructions and enough money to make those instructions stick. Nellie was 26 when her father died. She was 27 when Andrew arrived on the adjacent property. She had been running the ranch for a full year by then, through a brutal winter and a dry spring, with 2 hired hands named Cotto and Prentice who were loyal and hardworking, and not always equal to every task. She had figured out the rest herself, or asked the right questions in town, or made mistakes and corrected them, because that was what the situation required. Andrew had come to introduce himself the 3rd day after he moved in. He had knocked on her door at a reasonable hour with his hat in his hand, and told her his name, and that he was her new neighbor to the east, and that if she had any concerns about the fence line on that side, he intended to rebuild it from scratch, and she was welcome to ride the line with him before he began, to make sure they agreed on the placement. Nellie had looked at him for a moment. Men who arrived at her door that year usually arrived with an agenda visible in the first 30 seconds of conversation. Either they wanted to buy her out, or they wanted to help her in ways that would eventually become obligations, or they wanted to look around and judge whether she was managing correctly, whether a woman alone was really suited to this. Andrew Watkins had arrived and told her about the fence line. She had shaken his hand, which surprised him. She could see it in the slight adjustment of his expression, and told him she would ride it with him on Saturday if that suited him. It suited him. They had ridden the fence line that Saturday, and they had agreed on the placement without argument, and they had not become friends immediately or even quickly. It had taken time, the way things take time in country where everyone is busy and trust is built in increments, in small, reliable acts repeated until they add up to something solid. He helped her get a calf out of an arroyo in April. She told him about the water table on his side, where to dig, having watched her father negotiate that particular piece of geology for years. He fixed a section of her north fence when a storm blew it flat and she was in town. She left him a covered dish once when she heard he had been sick, set it on his porch without knocking, and he left the clean dish on her fence post 2 days later with a note that said only, "Thank you." By the fall of 1882, they were friends. By the spring of 1883, they were something that did not have a clean name, something that lived in the way he looked at her when she was not looking and the way she thought about things she wanted to tell him before she told anyone else. Something that neither of them reached for, because Andrew Watkins had been hardened by what reaching cost, and Nellie Fletcher had her hands entirely full keeping her father's legacy alive, and neither of them was sure the other felt it, and being wrong about that felt like a risk that could not be recovered from. And then Harlan Cole had arrived. Harlan Cole owned the largest single cattle operation in the county. He had inherited it from his father at 22, which meant he had never built anything himself, only managed and expanded what existed, and there was a difference between those two things that Harlan had never been required to understand. He was handsome in a blunt, significant way, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going silver at the temples at 42, and he dressed well and spoke well and knew every important man in the territory by his first name. He was also, at his core, a man who believed that things he wanted were eventually going to be his, because they always had been. He had come to Nellie 6 months after her father's funeral, and at first his visits were courteous, and his interest seemed like ordinary neighborly concern, one established rancher checking on a newcomer to the solitary responsibilities of property ownership. But Nellie was not someone who missed things. She saw the pattern develop. The visits became more frequent. The offers became more specific. The land, always the land, and then eventually, around Christmas of 1882, Harlan Cole had proposed marriage to Nellie Fletcher in her own parlor with the directness of a man who considered the question a formality. Nellie had said no, clearly and without cruelty, and Harlan had received it as a preliminary position rather than a final answer. And that was the beginning of a problem that had now been compounding for 8 months, and which had arrived at its present state that morning in the yard. Inside Nellie's kitchen, Andrew sat at the table he had sat at a dozen times before, and Nellie poured coffee from the iron pot and set a cup in front of him and sat down across from him with her own cup between her palms. The kitchen was clean and spare. A cast-iron stove, a pine table, shelves with the particular inventory of a working kitchen in 1883, sacks of flour and cornmeal, jars of preserved vegetables and dried beans, a string of dried chilies along one wall. Through the window, the morning light came in long and gold across the table between them. "He mentioned the water rights," Andrew said. Nellie nodded. "He always mentions the water rights. He knows it is the thing I cannot solve alone." The water situation was real. The creek that fed her property from the foothills had been partially diverted 3 years ago by the operations upstream, and what reached her land now was unreliable, Enough in a wet year, not enough in a dry one. She had been hauling supplemental water from town in dry stretches, which was expensive and unsustainable. Harlan Cole had rights to a spring on his property that could solve the problem. He knew it. She knew it. It was, she had come to understand, not incidental to his proposal but central to it. "What are your actual options on the water?" Andrew asked. She looked at him. This was what she meant about thinking of things she wanted to tell him first. She had not talked through the water problem with anyone, because she had not found anyone she trusted to think through it with her without either patronizing her or using the information. She had been carrying it alone for months. "There is a cistern option," she said. "If I could afford the construction and the labor to dig it deep enough, I could store enough water from the wet months to carry through the dry ones. But the cost is more than I have right now." "How much more?" "About $60 more than I have." Andrew was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee. $60 was not nothing. It was not everything either. "I have $60, he said. Nellie looked at him. "Andrew, it would be a loan, with whatever terms you consider fair." He met her eyes. "I am not offering you charity, and I am not offering you what Cole is offering. I am saying I have $60, and I would rather see it go into your cistern than sit in my strongbox while Cole uses your water problem to push you into a corner." The honesty of it, the directness, the fact that he had named what Cole was doing and named what he was not doing in the same breath, made something tighten in Nellie's throat. "I will think about it," she said. "All right," he said, and did not push further, and that was another thing about Andrew Watkins that she had catalogued over 2 years of careful attention. He did not push. He offered, and then he waited, and he respected the answer he got, which was rarer than it should have been in 1883 New Mexico, and which she was aware of every single time it happened. He finished his coffee. He set the cup on the table with the particular deliberateness of a man who is about to say something and is not sure yet whether to say it. Nellie watched him and waited. "You know he is not going to stop coming around," Andrew said. "Yes. And the next time he comes, I may not be within sight of the property." She looked at him steadily. "I know how to handle Harlan Cole." "I know you do." He paused. "I am not suggesting otherwise." Another pause, shorter. "I am suggesting that you should not have to handle him alone." The words were simple and plainly meant, but they landed somewhere in her chest that was not simple at all. And Nellie looked at Andrew Watkins across her kitchen table and saw for the first time the full, undisguised shape of what had been living in his expression for 2 years. The thing he did not say. The thing he came close to and then pulled back from. The thing that was in the coffee cup he held between his hands as if it needed steadying. "Andrew," she said, and her voice came out softer than she intended. He looked up. "Why do you keep not saying what you are thinking?" she asked. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of neighbors who had learned each other's rhythms. It was the silence of something arriving that had been traveling a long distance, and the sound it made when it finally came to rest was very quiet. Andrew set down his coffee cup. He turned it once on the table, a small habitual movement. Then he looked at her and stopped turning it. "Because I am not sure I have earned the right to say it," he said. Nellie felt her heart do something complicated. "That is not how it works," she said. "How does it work?" She thought about how to say it accurately. "You say it," she said, "and then we know where we are, and then we decide from where we are together. That is how it works." Andrew looked at her for a long moment. The morning light moved on the table between them. Outside, somewhere on her property, one of the horses made a sound and then was quiet again. "I have been in love with you," Andrew said carefully, "for approximately 18 months. I have not said so because I have made a significant error in the past by moving toward something I wanted before I was certain of the ground under my feet, and the cost of that error was considerable, and I did not want to do that to you or to myself again. And also because you had enough to manage without me adding to it." The plain honesty of it. The almost formal construction of it. The way he had clearly been carrying it and organizing it for a long time, because that was what Andrew Watkins did with things he felt. He organized them and examined them and waited until he was certain they were real before he let them out into the light. Nellie Fletcher looked at this man sitting at her kitchen table with his coffee cup and his sunburned forearms and his careful eyes, and she thought about the calf in the arroyo and the note on the fence post, and the way he had walked across the field this morning without running, and she thought, yes, I have been aware of that for approximately the same length of time, she said, and I have been waiting for you to find your way to saying it. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically. Just a settling, like a structure that has been braced against wind for so long it has forgotten what stillness feels like, and then the wind stops. You have, he said. Andrew, she said, and there was something almost warm and almost laughing in her voice. I am not unobservant, he looked at her, and then very slowly something that was almost a smile moved across his face, and it changed him entirely, the way light changes a landscape, finding angles and depths that the flat brightness of ordinary day does not reveal. No, he said, you are not unobservant. That is one of the things that I find particularly notable about you. One of them, she said. One of many, he said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the long morning light, and the thing that had been building for 2 years settled around them like weather clearing, like the particular quiet that comes after a storm passes and the air is washed clean and everything is still. The first time Andrew Watkins reached across the table and took Nellie Fletcher's hand in his, it was the simplest movement in the world, deliberate and unhurried, and her hand turned to meet his without hesitation. They sat like that for a while, not talking, because there was something restful about not having to talk, and neither of them had known that particular kind of rest before. The practical problem of Harlan Cole did not disappear simply because Andrew and Nellie had found their way to an honest place with each other. If anything, it intensified, because Harlan Cole was not stupid and he was attentive, and within a week of the confrontation in Nellie's yard, something had shifted in his approach that told Nellie he had drawn a conclusion about why Andrew had come across that field. He came to town on a Tuesday when Nellie was at the dry goods store, collecting supplies. She was loading flour sacks into the wagon when he pulled up alongside her in his carriage and told her politely that Andrew Watkins was not a settled man, that he had left Texas under circumstances that reflected poorly on his character, that a woman in her position could not afford to make poor choices about who she associated with. Nellie finished loading the flour and turned to look at Harlan Cole. What circumstances? She said. Harlan's mouth curved. A wife he abandoned, he said. Left her with debts and no prospects. It's a pattern with men like that. The story was a distortion of what had actually happened, which Nellie did not know yet in its full details, but which she suspected was not what Harlan was describing, because Harlan Cole had proven himself to be a man who did not let facts interfere with a story that served him. She had seen him tell versions of things before. She recognized the shape of a constructed narrative. I appreciate your concern, she said, without expression. I mean it genuinely, Nellie. I understand that you believe that, she said, and got into the wagon and drove home. That evening she sat on her porch and watched the last light leave the mountains and thought about what Harlan had said, not because she believed it, but because she believed in knowing the full shape of things, and she did not know Andrew's full history yet, and she thought she should. He came the next day to help Cato and Prentice with a section of barn roof that had been worrying her for weeks, as he sometimes did when he had time to spare, bringing his own tools and working without any production about it. When the work was done and the hands had gone to get their supper, Nellie brought him water and sat on the fence rail beside him. Harlan Cole told me you left a wife in Texas with debts, she said. She watched his face. He did not look away, which was the first thing she registered. He also did not look surprised, which was the second thing. He told you I abandoned her, Andrew said, more or less. Andrew drank the water and set the tin cup on the fence post. I was married in Texas, he said. Her name was Clara. We were both too young and not suited to each other in ways neither of us understood until we were living them. She left me. I did not leave her. She went with another man, and I did not contest it because contesting it would not have changed anything and would have cost her more than it cost me. There were no debts, I had savings. She took half of them, which was more than fair, and I kept the rest and used them to buy the Ray's property. He paused. That is the complete truth of it. Nellie looked at him. She had asked not because she doubted him, but because she needed to hear it, and hearing it now, the simple, direct way he told it, the absence of self-pity or embellishment, she felt the last edge of uncertainty dissolve. I believe you, she said. I know you do, he said. You would not have asked me directly if you did not plan to believe the answer. She looked at him. That is a very accurate observation. You are not the only one who is not unobservant, he said. She laughed, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh freely, without the careful management she usually kept over herself. And the sound of it did something to him that he stored in the part of himself where he kept the things that mattered. 3 weeks after the confrontation in the yard, Andrew began asking around about the cistern construction. He knew a man in Albuquerque who had done the work before, a Mexican engineer named Domingo Herrera, who had built water storage systems across the territory and was known for doing honest work at a fair price. Andrew wrote to him and got back a response within 10 days. Domingo could come out in the second week of October, assess the site, and give a price. Nellie agreed to this. She was more comfortable now with accepting the loan from Andrew because things had shifted between them and the nature of the offer had become clearer. It was not a gift, and it was not a leveraged kindness. It was a neighbor and something closer than a neighbor helping solve a real problem because he had the means to help and the inclination to use them. She negotiated the terms herself, insisted on it, wrote them down on paper. 6% interest, which was fair market. Repayment beginning the following spring after the first full season of operation. Andrew signed it without trying to alter any of the terms, and Nellie folded the paper and put it in the tin box where she kept important documents, and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem beginning to be solved on terms she had set. Domingo Herrera arrived in the second week of October as promised, a compact, precise man in his mid-40s with very clean hands and a leather satchel full of drawing instruments and measuring tools. He walked the property with Nellie and Andrew for 2 hours, measuring and making notes, and at the end he sat at Nellie's kitchen table and drew out the plan and gave his price. The price was $80. Nellie looked at the drawing for a moment. Andrew looked at it. Neither of them said the first thing they thought, which was the same thing. I can add 20, Andrew said. Nellie turned to look at him. Revised terms, he said. Same interest, same repayment schedule, just revised on the principle. Domingo Herrera looked between them with the expression of a man who understood exactly what was happening and had the courtesy not to comment on it. All right, Nellie said. Revised terms. She did not argue this time, and that shift, the willingness to accept his help without fighting it, was its own kind of declaration, small and private and significant. Domingo began the work the following week with 2 men from Santa Fe he had worked with for years. Nellie and her hands learned as the work progressed, because Nellie intended to maintain whatever was built on her property, and she wanted to understand it thoroughly. Domingo was patient with questions and taught her the principles behind what he was doing, the geology of the site, the mathematics of storage capacity, the mechanics of the intake system that would collect water from the wet months and route it into storage. Andrew came most evenings after his own work was done, not to supervise but to help where help was useful, hauling stone and timber and working alongside Cato and Prentice with the particular ease of a man who is comfortable with hard physical labor and does not make a performance of it. Nellie watched him sometimes from the edge of the work site and thought about the word that Harlan had used, hardened, and thought that Harlan did not know the first thing about what the word meant, because Andrew Watkins was not hard in the way that meant closed. He was solid in the way that meant reliable. Those were different things entirely. In the evenings, after the work crew had gone back to wherever they were staying in town, Andrew and Nellie sat on the porch sometimes and talked. These were the conversations that Nellie later thought of as the ones that built something. Not the declarations, not the significant moments, but the ordinary particular conversations about things they thought and remembered and wondered about. Andrew told her about Texas, not the painful parts first, but the landscape, the flat immensity of the Edwards Plateau, the way the sky there was a different sky than New Mexico's, flatter and somehow more exposed, so that you felt the weather coming for hours before it arrived. He told her about his family, his father who had been a farmer and not a rancher, and who had never quite understood why his son wanted cattle instead of crops, his mother who had died when Andrew was 19 of a fever that came and went in 3 days. He told her about the years of working other men's land, which had been good years in the sense that they had taught him everything, and long years in the sense that he was always aware of working towards something that was not yet his. Nellie told him about her father, which was the central story of her life in many ways, because James Fletcher had been not just a father but an education. He had taught her to read the land, to read the weather, to read animals and people. He had taught her figures and kept her in books, which was unusual for a girl in the territory in the 1870s, and had never once suggested to her that the ranch would need to be sold or managed by someone else when he was gone. He had simply prepared her, methodically and thoroughly, and then trusted her. "He sounds like a good man," Andrew said. "He was the best man I knew," Nellie said. Until recently. The silence after that was very full. Andrew reached over on the porch rail and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat in the cooling evening air of October in New Mexico and listened to the coyotes starting up on the ridge and said nothing more about it. He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening in late October, and it happened the way things happened between them, carefully and without ambiguity. They had been standing at the edge of the cistern site, which was nearly done, and Nellie had been looking at what had been built and feeling something that was not quite the word satisfaction, but was in that territory, and Andrew had been standing beside her looking at it too, and she had turned to say something to him about the intake angle that Domingo had adjusted that afternoon, and Andrew had been looking at her instead of the cistern, and the thing she had intended to say dissolved entirely. He said, "May I?" Which was the most Andrew Watkins question that had ever been asked in the history of the territory, and she thought, "Yes, always, where have you been?" and said, "Yes." He kissed her very carefully, the way he did everything, deliberately and without hurry, and it was the kind of kiss that rearranges things, that moves something fundamental from where it was to where it belongs. When they stepped apart, they were both very still for a moment, and then Nellie said, "The intake angle," and Andrew said, "Yes, right," and they looked at the cistern and she told him about the adjustment, and his hand found her hand, and that was that. Harlan Cole was not finished. A man like Harlan Cole did not accept a situation because it had become clear. He accepted nothing until he had exhausted every available angle, and he had more angles than most men. In November, he went to the county land office in Santa Fe and filed a challenge to one section of Nellie's property boundary, a small disputed strip along the southern edge that had been vaguely described in the original survey from 20 years earlier. The challenge itself was not credible, as Nellie's lawyer in Santa Fe, a capable man named William Garvey, told her when she rode in to see him. But it required response and created the possibility of delay and legal cost, which was its purpose. "He is trying to wear you down," Garvey said. "I know what he is trying to do," Nellie said. "Tell me what it costs to shut it down," Garvey told her. The cost was not catastrophic, but it was real, added to the cistern loan and the dry summer's supplemental water expenses. She rode home in the cold November rain and sat in her kitchen and laid out her figures on paper and looked at them with the level gaze of someone who deals with what is rather than what she would prefer. Andrew arrived that evening. He did not know about the land office challenge yet. He came because they had fallen into the habit of each other's company in the evenings, a habit that had grown from occasional to frequent to daily, without either of them quite noting the transition. He came in out of the rain, and saw the papers on the table and her face above them. She told him. He sat down and listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What does Garvey think about the timeline? 3 months minimum, possibly 5. And the cost?" She told him the figure. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Harlan Cole has done this before. He filed a similar challenge against the Montoya family 3 years ago over on the north side of the valley." Nellie looked up. "Did he win?" "No. But the Montoyas spent 6 months and most of their reserves fighting it, and by the time it was dismissed, they were willing to sell him grazing rights they hadn't been willing to sell before, just to recover financially." He met her eyes. "It's a trap. Not a legal strategy, a financial trap." The word trap settled in her chest with a cold weight. "I know," she said. "Then you also know that the answer is not to let him shrink your resources until you're choosing between the legal cost and the operational cost." "Andrew," she said carefully, "I am not taking more money from you." "I am not offering money," he said. "I am offering something else." She looked at him. He reached across the table and picked up one of the figures she had written down. He looked at it for a moment and set it down. He looked at her. "I know this is not the most romantic context for this question," he said. "And I know I have been moving slowly because I believe in moving at the right speed for the right reasons and not faster. But I have been thinking about this for several weeks now, and I think the time is right, or near enough to right that the difference does not matter." Nellie's heart was doing something irregular, and she was aware of it and chose to say nothing and let him continue. "I would like to marry you," Andrew said. "Not because of Harlan Cole, although I will be honest and say that the situation with him does clarify the advantage of a combined operation. Not because of the legal challenge or the water rights or the financial pressure, although all of those things are real and relevant. But because I have been in love with you for a year and a half and I believe you are the most capable and interesting and honest person I have come across in my life. And I want to keep having the conversations we have, and doing the work we do, and sitting on the porch in the evenings. And I want to do all of those things with the clarity of being your husband rather than with the ambiguity of being whatever I am now." The rain on the roof was steady and quiet. The lamp on the table made a small, warm circle in the dark kitchen. Nellie Fletcher looked at Andrew Watkins and thought about every version of a proposal she had ever imagined or witnessed. Harlan Cole's presumptuous certainty in her parlor, the romantic versions she had read in the novels her father had given her, the practical arrangements she had seen between ranching families who married for land and found something better over time or something worse. She thought about what Andrew had just said, not the most romantic context. He had said, and he had said it because he was constitutionally incapable of pretending the context was something other than what it was, and that honesty was one of the things she loved most about him. She loved him. She had not said it yet in those words, but it had been true for some time, and she knew it in the way she knew the weather coming off the mountains, not as a guess but as a reading of real information. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." Andrew looked at her and the settling thing happened again in his face, the release of something long held. "All right," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady, which she noted and stored in the same place she kept the laugh. "Were you uncertain?" she asked. "No," he said. "But knowing something and hearing it confirmed are different things." She reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers with a firmness that was not pressure but presence. "Andrew," she said, "I love you." He looked at her for a moment, this woman who said true things plainly and meant them entirely. "I love you, Nellie," he said. "I have for a long time." They were married on the second Saturday of December, 1883, at the small church in town, in a service conducted by Reverend Moses Hadley, who was a plain-spoken man with a good heart and the sense to keep the ceremony brief in deference to the cold. There were perhaps 30 people present, neighbors and townspeople who liked Nellie and had come to respect Andrew over his 2 years in the territory. Cato and Prentice were there. Domingo Herrera was there, having stayed in the area through the fall on another job. William Garvey had ridden out from Santa Fe. Harlan Cole was not there, which was appropriate on every level. Nellie wore her mother's blue wool dress, which she had found in a chest in the back bedroom and spent 3 evenings altering to fit her properly. Andrew wore his good coat, which he had brushed for the occasion and which fit him well enough. They stood in front of Reverend Hadley and said the words, and Andrew put a simple gold band on her finger that he had bought from the jeweler in Santa Fe on a trip he had made without telling her, and she looked at it on her hand and then at him and thought, "Mine. This is mine and I am his, and we built this from the ground up ourselves, and no one gave it to us." After the ceremony, there was a small gathering at a neighbor's place. The Ortega family, who had known James Fletcher for years and who had been kind to Nellie through the hard first year. There was food and there was fiddle music, and the cold, clear December air smelled of wood smoke and pine. And at some point in the evening, Andrew led Nellie out onto the porch away from the noise, and they stood in the dark with the stars above them, which in that part of New Mexico in December were not just numerous but architectural, built into the sky in a way that seemed intentional. He pulled her against him, and she leaned into him and felt the solid reality of him. This man who had been her neighbor, and then her friend, and then her something more, and was now her husband. And the layers of that accumulation seemed to her one of the more remarkable things she had ever been part of. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That I am very glad you knocked on my door," she said. He pressed his mouth to her temple. "So am I," he said. The land challenge filed by Harlan Cole was dismissed by the territorial court in February of 1884. William Garvey had done thorough work, pulling the original survey documents from the Federal Land Office and presenting a case that was clean and clear and left no room for ambiguity. The presiding judge, a meticulous man named Judge Alcott, who had seen similar tactics in land disputes before and had no patience for them, dismissed the challenge in under an hour of consideration and added a note to the record that the original boundary had been adequately established and that further challenges of this nature would be viewed with skepticism. Nellie received the telegram from Garvey in town on a Tuesday morning and rode home with it in her coat pocket and found Andrew repairing the cattle gate at the bottom of the drive. She handed him the telegram. He read it. He handed it back. "Good," he said. "That is your response," she said. "What else is there to say?" "It is a fair outcome." She looked at him. "It is a relief is what it is." He smiled at her, and it was the full version of the smile she had catalogued since October, the one that changed his face entirely. "Yes," he said, "it is also that." That evening they sat at the kitchen table, which was now their kitchen table, in the house that was now their house, because Andrew had moved his things from the Ray's property in December, and they had begun the slow process of combining 2 lives in one place. The Ray's property they were keeping and running as an extension of the combined operation, which had given them nearly 170 acres of rangeland between them, enough to build something substantial over the next several years. Andrew had worked out the water rights situation in January with a straightforwardness that Nellie admired. He had not gone to Harlan Cole. He had gone to the county water commissioner with the documentation of the original creek diversion and the evidence of impact on the Fletcher property, and the commissioner had ordered a partial restoration of the flow. It was not everything, but the new cistern handled the rest, and for the first time in 3 years Nellie's water supply was stable. Harlan Cole had made no further moves. Whether this was because the court's response to the land challenge had demonstrated that his tactics would not succeed, or because he had redirected his attention elsewhere, or because something in him had finally accepted the reality of the situation, Nellie could not entirely determine. He was still in the county, still the largest single operator, still powerful. But he was no longer appearing on her road or at her door, and the absence of him was like the absence of a low, constant noise she had grown so accustomed to she had forgotten it was there until it stopped. Spring came slowly in 1884, with late frost that lasted into April, and then broke all at once into warm weather that felt almost violent after the long cold. The cattle they had wintered came through well. Both herds combined now under the management of Andrew and Cato and Prentice, and a new hand named Eduardo, who was the youngest brother of one of Domingo Herrera's workers, and who had stayed in the area after the cistern job because he liked the country. Nellie was busy with the books and the correspondence and the practical management of the combined operation, which had grown complex enough to require real organizational effort. She had set up a proper system, 2 ledgers, one for the cattle operation and one for the property expenses, and she kept them with the same methodical attention her father had taught her. Andrew reviewed them with her weekly, and these sessions, which were ostensibly practical, had developed a quality she had not anticipated, which was that going through the numbers together, arguing about expenditure priorities and resource allocation and seasonal planning, was oddly intimate. They were building something together, and the building was as close as they came to speaking about the future, which they both found easier to approach practically than directly. In May she told him she thought she was expecting. She told him on the porch in the evening, which was where the significant things between them tended to happen. She had waited until she was certain, which had taken several weeks of careful attention to her own body and some private research, and then a quiet conversation with the doctor in town who confirmed it. Andrew was very still when she told him. She watched his face and saw something move through it that was too large to name, something between joy and terror and a kind of gravity, a sense of consequence landing. "Are you well?" he said, and his voice was careful. "I am very well," she said. "Are you? How do you feel about it?" "Andrew," she said, "I am happy." He looked at her and then he stood up and came to her and put his arms around her, and she felt the slight unsteadiness in him, the normally rock-solid Andrew Watkins actually affected in his body by the news, and she held him back and felt him settle. "I am happy too," he said against her hair. "I am also frightened." "That is reasonable," she said. "Is it?" "Of course it is. You're going to be somebody's father." He was quiet for a moment. "I will work very hard at that," he said. "I know you will," she said. "You work very hard at everything." He pulled back enough to look at her, and his face was doing the thing she loved, the settled and revealed thing, the absence of armor. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said. The summer of 1884 passed in the steady rhythm of ranch work and preparation, the work expanding now to include the gradual transformation of the east bedroom into a nursery, which Andrew undertook with the same systematic care he gave to any construction project, building a small crib from pine he had dried over the winter and planing it smooth until there was no edge that could catch or scratch. He did this in the evenings after the ranch work was done, and Nellie sometimes sat in the doorway and watched him work and thought about the version of him she had first seen, all sharp edges and careful distance, and the version she lived with now, still methodical and still private in certain ways, but open to her in a way she did not take for granted and did not intend to. In October of 1884, their son was born. The birth was attended by the midwife in town, a capable Tejana woman named Maria Cruz, who had delivered half the children in the county and who worked with a calm efficiency that helped Nellie through the long and difficult night of it. Andrew was in the house the entire time, which was not the common practice, men generally removing themselves from childbirth as if it were something that required privacy from them specifically. Andrew had said simply that he intended to stay if Nellie wanted him to, and Nellie had said she wanted him to, and Maria Cruz had accepted this without comment because she had seen every variety of husband in 30 years of this work, and she had preferences. When it was over and the boy was cleaned and wrapped and placed in Nellie's arms, Andrew sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression that Nellie had no category for and did not try to categorize. She just let it be what it was. "He looks very small," Andrew said. "He is the right size," Maria Cruz said from the doorway with the authority of someone who had calibrated this many times. Andrew looked at Nellie. "Are you all right?" "I am exhausted," she said, "and I am all right." He reached out very carefully and touched the baby's cheek with one finger just once. They named him James for Nellie's father. Andrew had suggested it, and Nellie had cried quietly, which she had not done often in front of him, and he had understood without being told exactly what it meant. James Fletcher Watkins grew in the way healthy babies grow in good homes, loudly and demandingly, and with an increasing range of opinions about everything. By the spring of 1885, he was a large-eyed, vigorous infant who appeared to be conducting an ongoing experiment on the limits of his parents' capacity for sleep. And Andrew, who had never thought of himself as a man who would be comfortable with infants, found himself walking the length of the house at 2 in the morning with the baby on his shoulder, with a patience and steadiness that surprised him less than it might have once. Nellie watched him do this sometimes from the bedroom doorway, half asleep, and thought about the word hardened, and thought that Harlan Cole had not been entirely wrong to observe it, only wrong about what it meant. Andrew Watkins had been hardened in the way that made him stronger under pressure, not in the way that made him unable to be soft when softness was what was needed. The two were not incompatible, and perhaps only people who had never been required to be both at once would think they were. The operation continued to grow through 1885 and into 1886. They added cattle carefully, at a rate the land could sustain. They hired another hand, a young man from the Pueblos named Gabriel, who was quietly excellent with horses and who became Eduardo's particular friend, and who worked with a diligence that earned Andrew's respect quickly, which was the most meaningful endorsement available in their small operation. The combined Watkins Ranch, which they ran under the name Fletcher Watkins after a conversation in which Nellie had said she wanted her father's name on the gate, and Andrew had said of course, had become one of the more stable operations in the county by 1886. Not the largest. Harlan Cole's operation remained larger by a significant margin, but stable in a way that some larger operations were not, because it was managed carefully, with two people who understood the land they were working and made decisions about it with patience and collective judgment. Harlan Cole had become, in the 3 years since his last visit to Nellie's yard, a figure in the county rather than a presence in their lives. They encountered him at the county stock exchange twice a year, and at the occasional social event that both parties could not avoid, and these encounters were handled by both sides with the distant courtesy of people who had a shared history they had agreed not to revisit. Harlan Cole was not a warm man toward them, but he was not actively antagonistic, and Nellie had come to understand that his pursuit of her had been more about property than sentiment anyway, and that his response to losing that pursuit was primarily economic, which meant it could be managed. She told Andrew this one evening, and he looked at her for a moment and said, "I think you are right." And I think there may have been a version of it that was genuine, in the way that people confuse wanting to possess something with feeling affection for it. Nellie considered this. "That is a generous interpretation," she said. "I am occasionally capable of those," he said, which made her laugh. In the summer of 1886, Nellie realized she was expecting again. She told Andrew on the porch in the evening, same location as before, and watched his face go through the same movement of joy and gravity, slightly faster this time because the fear was less, but no less real in what it meant. "James is going to be very interested in this," Andrew said. James at almost 2 was very interested in everything, with particular focus on the dog they had acquired that spring, a rangy blue heeler named Scout who had attached himself to James with the specific devotion of a working dog who has found his person. "He will probably try to share Scout with the baby," Nellie said. "Is that a problem?" "Scout will be very patient about it," she said. "The second child was born in February of 1887. This one came faster and easier, which Maria Cruz said was the usual way of it with second children, and was a girl, which they had not expected or prepared for specifically because preparation for either was the same preparation. They named her Frances, for Andrew's mother, which made Andrew go very quiet for a moment in a way that Nellie understood. Frances Watkins was from the first day a different creature than James. Where James had been loud and demanding and vigorous, Frances was watchful. She observed everything from the beginning, her dark eyes moving over the world with an attention that Nellie recognized as familiar. "She looks at things the way you do," Andrew said once, watching Frances from across the room. "How is that?" Nellie asked. "Like she is deciding what they mean," he said. James was devoted to his sister in the way that small children are devoted to younger siblings, with a mixture of possessive pride and competitive anxiety that was entirely natural and mostly expressed itself in bringing Frances objects, and then reconsidering whether she should have them. Scout regarded Frances with the polite uncertainty of a dog who had adjusted his loyalties once and was willing to do it again but needed more information first. The life they had built, which had its beginning in a confrontation in a dusty yard and its foundation in 2 years of coffee and fence lines and careful accumulation, settled into the rhythm of something established. Not static, established. There is a difference, which is that static things do not grow or change, and established things have a solidity that allows them to grow and change without losing their shape. Andrew Watkins was not the same man who had come to New Mexico in 1882 with his savings and his silence and his carefully maintained self-sufficiency. He was still private in certain ways, still deliberate, still moved through the world with the methodical attention of a man who had learned to think before he acted. But he was also the man who walked the house at 2 in the morning with a baby on his shoulder, and who brought Nellie coffee before she asked for it, and who had said "I love you" first in her kitchen over a table of financial figures, and who had learned, slowly and not without difficulty, that the ground under his feet was solid enough now that moving towards something he wanted was not the risk it had once been. He told her this one night in their 5th year of marriage, lying in the dark of their bedroom with the wind coming off the mountains and both children asleep down the hall. He told her about what Clara's leaving had made of him, the full version, not the version he had given her in the beginning, but the internal version, what it had done to the architecture of himself, the way it had convinced him that wanting things led to losing them and that the safest position was one of careful need, needing nothing you could not provide yourself. Nellie listened and did not say anything until he finished. Then she said, "Is that still true?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "It has not been true for a long time, but I carried it past its usefulness." "Most people do," she said. "You did not." "I had different lessons," she said. "Father did not teach me to protect myself by wanting less. He taught me to know what I wanted and work toward it." She paused. "I wanted the ranch. I wanted to be capable. I wanted you." The last thing was said simply and without drama as a fact among facts. Andrew turned toward her in the dark. He found her hand. "I am glad you waited," he said, "for me to find my way to saying it." "I was very patient," she said, and there was the warmth in her voice, the thing that was almost laughter. "Heroically patient," he said. "Heroically," she agreed. He kissed her in the dark, and she leaned into him, and the wind came off the mountains, and the children slept down the hall, and Scout was probably on James's bed again despite the rule about that. And the house they had built into a home held all of it, all of them, without strain. The year 1888 brought a development that neither of them had anticipated, which was an inquiry from the territorial government about a road expansion project that would run through a corner of the county, and which raised the question of whether any of the local ranching operations would be affected by the right-of-way survey. The inquiry came to them because the proposed route passed within a quarter-mile of their southern boundary, and while it did not directly threaten their property, it made Nellie think about the county in a larger way, about what was coming and what she and Andrew needed to understand about the changing territory. She had been reading about New Mexico statehood for several years. There had been repeated attempts to bring the territory into the Union, and each one had run into various political obstacles, and the resolution of those obstacles remained uncertain. What was certain was that the territory was changing, growing more populated, more settled, more connected to the economic systems of the rest of the country, and that the ranching operations that would survive into the next century would be the ones that adapted rather than the ones that continued to operate as if the world of 1875 were permanent. She talked to Andrew about this over several evenings, and he listened with the attention he gave to things he considered important, asking questions that pushed the thinking further rather than questions that challenged the premise. "We should expand the cattle numbers," he said finally, "but not past what the land can carry. And we should think about the market, not just the local buyers." "The railroad," Nellie said. "Yes," he said. "If the Santa Fe line extends the spur as far as they've been saying, we'll have access to the Chicago market within 3 years. The scale of operation that supports changes." This was, in 1888, a significant piece of forward planning for a ranching operation of their size. Most of their neighbors were focused on the immediate season, which was appropriate, because the immediate season could destroy you if you did not attend to it. But Nellie had learned from her father to hold two things at once, the immediate and the distant, and Andrew's 7 years of working other men's operations had given him a picture of what scale looked like and what it required. They began planning for growth, carefully, in the deliberate incremental way they approached everything, adding to the herd by 20 head per season, expanding the grazing rotation to account for larger numbers, planning a second cistern on the raised side of the property that would cover the eastern range in dry years. Eduardo and Gabriel had been with them long enough now to be considered not just hands, but trusted members of the operation, and Andrew had begun paying them bonuses in good years, and talking with them about what the operation's growth would mean for their own situations, which was the kind of management practice that was not universal in the territory, and which produced loyalty of the kind that was worth more than any wage differential. Gabriel, in the spring of 1888, had begun courting a young woman from one of the Pueblo communities to the north, a woman named Antonia who was 20 years old and serious-minded, and who rode better than anyone on the ranch, including Andrew, which Andrew acknowledged without hesitation. Nellie liked Antonia from the first meeting and invited her to the ranch for Sunday dinners with the straightforwardness of someone who saw no reason to manage the situation cautiously. And Antonia arrived the first time with the wariness of a woman who has learned to expect careful management, and left the second time with something that was beginning to be ease. Gabriel married Antonia in the summer of 1889 in a ceremony at the Pueblo that both Nellie and Andrew attended with James and Francis, who were 5 and 2 respectively, and required constant attention, but were present and welcomed. It was one of the first times Andrew had been inside a Pueblo community, and he moved through the day with the specific care of a man who knows he is a guest in something that predates him by centuries and intends to conduct himself accordingly. Nellie watched him and loved him for it. James at 5 was in the specific phase of wanting to know the explanation for everything, which meant that any event attended by a 5-year-old James Watkins became an educational exercise for everyone present, as James asked questions of every adult within reach about whatever was happening and why. Gabriel handled this with patience that spoke well of his future parenting prospects. Antonia answered James's questions with the directness that characterized everything she did, which James respected, because James at 5 could already detect when an adult was giving him a managed answer versus a real one. Francis at 2 was in the phase of attempting to walk faster than her legs could currently support, which produced a constant low-level physical crisis that Nellie navigated with the automated efficiency of a woman who had been doing it for several months and knew exactly how close to a fall was acceptable. On the ride home that evening, with James asleep against Andrew's side in the wagon and Francis asleep in Nellie's lap, Andrew reached over and found Nellie's hand in the dark and held it, and she turned to look at him in the faint starlight. "Good day," he said quietly, not waking the children. "Very good day," she said. They drove home through the New Mexico night with the stars above them and the children warm and heavy and asleep. And Nellie thought about the day and about the years behind it and the years ahead of it, and felt the solid reality of the life they had built. Not the life she had imagined before she knew what to imagine, but something better, something specific and real and entirely their own. In the fall of 1889, Harlan Cole's operation ran into difficulties that had nothing to do with the Fletcher Watkins ranch, and everything to do with Harlan Cole's tendency to overextend. He had borrowed heavily to expand his cattle numbers in advance of a market upturn that had not materialized at the scale he anticipated, and when the prices came in lower than his projections for 2 consecutive seasons, the debt became visible. He sold the southern section of his property to a developer from Albuquerque and pulled back his operation to the core holdings, which was painful but survivable. Nellie heard this from William Garvey, who kept her informed of county developments as a professional courtesy. She received the information and felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy, which seemed accurate. Harlan Cole had made his decisions as he always had, with the confidence of a man who believed his advantages made him immune to the consequences of miscalculation, and he had been wrong about that, which was the outcome his approach had always been trending toward. She told Andrew that evening, and he listened and was also quiet for a moment and then said, "Does it change anything for us?" "Not operationally," she said. "The water rights are settled and the land boundary is settled, and he has not been a factor in 3 years. "Then it doesn't change anything," Andrew said. "No," she said, "it doesn't." And it didn't. That was the truth of it. The situation with Harlan Cole had been resolved not dramatically but completely, by the accumulation of good decisions and legal clarity, and the simple durability of a life built well. He was still in the county, diminished but present, and he would live out his years as the man who had once been the largest operator and had overreached. And Nellie bore him no particular malice about it, because she had never wanted anything from him except to be left alone, and now she was. The decade turned. 1890 arrived with a hard winter and an early thaw and a spring that was the best water year they had seen in several seasons. The cisterns were full by April, and the creek was running at levels that Nellie had not seen in the 8 years she had been managing the property alone and with Andrew. The cattle came through the winter in good condition, and the calf numbers that spring were the best the operation had produced. James was 6 and had begun attending the school in town, which meant the early mornings had acquired a new rhythm centered on getting a 6-year-old into presentable condition and onto a horse for the ride to the schoolhouse, which James experienced as both an adventure and an injustice depending on the morning. Andrew rode with him most days, dropping him at the schoolhouse and continuing into town for whatever needed doing, and picking him up in the afternoon. These rides were, by James's account, primarily educational, because James asked questions the entire way in both directions. Frances at 3 was still the observant one, though she had developed a specific passion for the horses that was more than casual interest, and that Nellie recognized with some amusement as the same quality of attention she gave to anything she cared about, total and patient and completely serious. Antonia had taken a particular interest in Frances's horse education, since Antonia's riding was the best on the ranch, and Frances sat in front of Antonia on horseback with an expression of deep satisfaction that suggested she had found her territory. In the spring of 1890, Nellie told Andrew she was expecting again. Andrew received this news with the specific expression she had come to know, the joy-gravity combination, but faster now, and with a quality of delight that the first 2 times had been complicated by anxiety and was now cleaner. "James is going to want it to be a boy," he said. "James will be assigned the role of excellent older sibling regardless," Nellie said. "Francis will accept it as long as it does not interfere with the horses," Andrew said. "Francis's priorities are very clear," Nellie agreed. The third child arrived in November of 1890, a boy, which James received with the satisfaction of someone whose preference has been honored, and whom they named Daniel, for no specific reason except that it was a name that felt right and solid, which was the Watkins approach to most decisions. Daniel was from the first day the loudest of the 3, which established the family hierarchy of noise conclusively, with James second and Francis operating in a register of quiet intensity that somehow made more impact than either of her brothers' volume. Scout, now 7 and beginning to slow down slightly, regarded the new baby with the philosophical acceptance of a dog who has weathered a great deal and is not surprised by anything. By 1892, the Fletcher-Watkins operation had grown to the point where Andrew was regularly in contact with buyers in Albuquerque and had made 2 trips to Kansas City to establish relationships with the larger market buyers there. The railroad spur had extended as predicted, which meant that cattle from the territory could move east with an efficiency that changed the economics of their scale. They were not wealthy in the absolute sense, but they were solidly prosperous, in the way that comes from 10 years of careful decisions compounded. Nellie had taken on a role that she had not anticipated in the beginning of their partnership, which was as an informal advocate for other women in the county who were managing or inheriting property, and who encountered the same legal and financial obstacles she had navigated. She did not have formal standing to provide legal advice, and she was careful to direct people to Garvey when they needed actual legal services. But she had knowledge, and she had the willingness to share it, and she had the reputation of someone who had succeeded in circumstances that were not designed to allow it. Several of the ranching women in the county had found their way to her kitchen table over the years, and she had talked through water rights and land law and financial management, and the particular problem of men like Harlan Cole, and she had given them the information she had, without softening it or managing it for their comfort, because comfort was not what the situation required, and she had never found comfort useful. Andrew was aware of this aspect of her life and supported it without directing it, which was the correct approach and the one she would have expected from him. He understood, she thought, better than most men of his era that her capacities and her work had not diminished to include him, they had expanded to include him, and that the difference between those 2 things was everything. He told her once, in a rare moment of articulation about the thing they had built, "I think the best version of a marriage is one in which each person is more capable because of the other, not less." She had looked at him and said, "Where did that come from?" "I have been thinking about it," he said, "since roughly 1882. She had laughed at that, the full free laugh he had first heard in 1883 and which still had the same effect on him a decade later, and he had looked at her with the unguarded expression she had first seen in the kitchen and which was now the default, the armor genuinely set aside, no longer needed. In the summer of 1893, James Watkins was 9, and Francis was 6, and Daniel was 2, and Scout had gone peacefully in the spring, which had been the first experience of loss for the older children, and which had been managed with the honesty Andrew and Nellie had applied to everything, acknowledging that it was real and that grief was appropriate, and that the space Scout had occupied in the family was real and worth mourning. They got a new dog that fall, a puppy from Gabriel and Antonia's dog's litter, a blue heeler again, which James named captain with the authority of oldest child, and which Daniel immediately tried to ride, and which Francis assessed with the measuring look and accepted when it became clear the puppy had sufficient intelligence. The life had the texture of something fully inhabited. Not perfect, because nothing fully inhabited is perfect. There were hard seasons and difficult decisions, and the occasional argument that required several days to resolve. And the physical demands of the work were constant and occasionally brutal. And the territory was still a rough place in many ways, with all the inequities and injustices that characterized the West in the 1890s, including the ongoing displacement of the Pueblo communities that Gabriel came from, which was something Andrew and Nellie talked about and were not entirely sure how to address from where they stood, except to conduct themselves in their own operations with fairness and respect, and to speak clearly when they saw wrong being done. But it was a life they had made, and they had made it together, and the making of it had been its own thing, not just the having of it. Andrew turned 40 in 1892. Nellie turned 37 the same year. Neither of them marked it dramatically. They were not people who made much of milestones, preferring the daily continuation to the ceremonial acknowledgement. But that fall, on an evening in late October when the aspens in the foothills had gone gold, and the air had the particular clarity that comes to New Mexico in autumn, Andrew and Nellie rode up to the top of the rise on the raised side of the property, which had the widest view in either direction, and sat on their horses in the fading afternoon light and looked at everything. The land spread below them, the combined property with its cisterns and fences and corrals, and the house where their children were with Eduardo's wife watching them. The mountains to the east, the long descent of the high desert to the south, going purple in the late light. The sky above them, which was the New Mexico sky, specific and enormous and entirely itself. Nellie looked at it and thought about the morning she had stood on her porch watching Harlan Cole ride away, with Andrew Watkins standing in her yard, having come across the field to put himself between her and a situation that was not his, and having meant by that action something he would not put words to for 3 more months. She thought about the kitchen table and the coffee and the 2 years of accumulation before any of it, the fence line and the arroyo calf, and the note left on the fence post. She thought about what she had built not alone but with her father's foundation and her own work, and this man beside her who had come from Texas with his savings and his silence and had turned out to be the person she trusted most in the world. Andrew looked at the view for a long moment and then looked at her. "You all right?" he said. "I am perfectly all right," she said. "I am thinking." "About what?" "About how we got here," she said. "From where we were." He looked back at the view. "It is considerable distance," he said. "It is," she said. He reached over and she reached over, and they held hands on horseback in the October light at the top of the rise. 2 people who had arrived at the same place by very different routes and had found each other on the way and had decided, carefully and clearly and without ambiguity, to continue together, and who had been continuing ever since. "Andrew," she said. "Yes. I would do it exactly the same way," she said. "All of it." He looked at her. The expression she loved, complete and undefended. "So would I," he said. They stayed until the light left the mountains and the first stars appeared, and then they turned and rode home together through the cooling dark, toward the house where their children were waiting, and the life they had made was ongoing and complete. The years that followed settled into the particular richness of a life that has found its shape and is living in it. James grew into a serious, capable boy who showed an aptitude for the financial management of the operation that pleased Nellie and did not surprise Andrew. Frances grew into a girl who could ride better than anyone in the county at 10, which Antonia took as a point of personal pride, and who read everything she could find, which meant Nellie kept her supplied with books from the lending library in Santa Fe. Daniel was the social one, the one who made friends with everyone, and who had a quality of ease in every situation that made him effective with animals and people in equal measure. Andrew taught his sons to build and to manage and to read the land. He taught his daughter the same things when she asked, which she always did, with the measuring look that said she would settle for nothing less than the actual information. Nellie taught all 3 of them to read figures, to manage correspondence, to understand the legal dimensions of property. She also taught them, by example and occasionally by direct instruction, that the world they lived in required negotiation, that its systems were not neutral, and that people were sometimes treated unjustly for reasons that had nothing to do with their merit or their work, and that knowing this and being willing to see it clearly was the beginning of doing something about it. In 1895, New Mexico was still a territory. It would not become a state until 1912, a fact that was a source of ongoing frustration to people who lived there and cared about self-governance, and Nellie cared and was not quiet about it. Andrew also cared and was somewhat quieter about it, but his quietness was not indifference. It was the same thoroughness he brought to everything, waiting until he had thought it through completely before committing to a position. The operation by 1895 had expanded to the point where they were one of the larger cattle operations in the county, though still not as large as what Harlan Cole's had been at its peak. They had made the expansions deliberately, always within what the land could sustain, always within what the finances could support without dangerous exposure. This approach had cost them speed but bought them stability, and in the long run they had not regretted it. They were 55 miles from Santa Fe and 70 miles from Albuquerque, and the railroad connection had changed what those distances meant. The children grew up in a world that was, despite its remoteness, connected to a larger one, and the railroad brought news and goods and people who brought different perspectives, and all of this was part of what they were raising their children in. In the fall of 1897, on a day in September when the light was long and golden, and the cattle were fat from a good summer, and James was 13, and Francis was 10, and Daniel was 7, Andrew and Nellie sat on the porch after supper while the children were inside and the evening was cooling, and Nellie looked at the sky to the east over the mountains and said, "I think we should build a second barn." Andrew considered this. "We have been talking about it for 2 years. I think the time is right now." "I think so too," he said. They looked at the mountains together for a while. In the yard below the porch, Captain the Blue Heeler was doing his evening patrol of the fence line, competent and methodical. "Andrew," Nellie said. "Yes." "Are you happy?" He looked at her. The question did not surprise him, and he did not treat it as simple. "Yes," he said. "Genuinely and entirely." He paused. "Are you?" She looked at the mountains and the sky and the yard and the life they had built in this particular piece of the world, and she thought about her father and the land he had left her, and the morning she had stood on these porch steps with her hands on the railing watching a man she did not yet want walk away, and another man she already loved if she was honest, crossing the field with purpose and without hurry. "Yes," she said, "genuinely and entirely." He reached for her hand. She gave it to him, as she had been giving it to him for 14 years, without hesitation and without reservation, because that was the covenant they had made, not in Reverend Hadley's church, though they had made it there too, but in every morning and every evening and every fence line and every cup of coffee and every figure in a ledger and every child asleep down the hall and every coyote starting up on the ridge and every October evening on a rise looking out at the land they had made their own. Andrew Watkins held his wife's hand on the porch of their home as the sky went dark and the stars came up over New Mexico in their thousands, and Nellie Fletcher Watkins held his, and everything that needed saying had been said, and everything that needed building had been built, and the night was quiet and full, and they were home.